So the class today is using lease options to buy and sell property. Lease options are one of my favorite tools to use for a couple reasons. Number one, they're very simple. A lease option is a contract. And if you keep it simple, and I like to, my whole game is to keep things as simple as possible. If you keep it simple, you close more deals. People that have elaborate paperwork come up with long contracts, 8 or 10-page contracts, and then try to get somebody to sign them who's never seen this type of offer before, have trouble getting deals closed. So if you're making any kind of offer to somebody, we're going to talk about both buying and selling on lease options today. If you're dealing with somebody on the other side of the table who doesn't have a lot of experience, and that's often the case. If you're buying a home from a homeowner, many times it's the only home they've ever sold, or if you're selling a house to somebody with a lease option, it may be the only house they've ever bought. You have to keep the paperwork simple, because where people get in trouble and where people end up in court is when one person doesn't understand the deal. They just think they understand it, they don't understand it. So you'll see the kind of the theme of the class as we go through things is to keep things as simple as possible, keep your paperwork as simple as possible. And in the real estate business, the paperwork can get overwhelming. Have you noticed that? Anybody been to a closing lately? Does anybody ever read all the stuff they sign at a closing? They can't. I mean, you just don't have enough days to read all that stuff. So when you're buying, you want to think, okay, if I'm dealing with somebody who has no experience in real estate, I have to be careful about how I talk to them, what words I use. And if you say I want to buy your house on a lease option, you probably understand what that means, but the people on the other side of the table wouldn't understand what that means. So you have to talk, and we'll talk through this as we go through the class, but you have to talk in terms of benefits for people. Rather than say, I want to buy your house on a lease option, you might say to them something like, I'll take over your house. I'll start mowing your grass. I'll start making your loan payments. You'll never have to see this house again. Well, that sings to them, right? Because maybe that's what they want to do, is get rid of the house, not see it again, not mow the grass, not make loan payments. So if you talk in terms of benefits, instead of using a legal term, you make much more progress with people. I started this business years ago. I was working for a guy one time, and I was doing surveying for him, and this is back when I was a kid, and we had this whole building surveyed in, and he showed up one day and said, no, it's in the wrong place. He went around and pulled up all the survey stakes. Now, this is after we worked for a whole week doing the survey, and said, move it 6 feet this way. I said, how can a guy this dumb make money in real estate? And I watched him for a while, and I was probably about 19 at the time. By the time I was 19 and a half, I was much smarter, because I noticed he had his own airplane. He had his own sailboat. He had his own big house. He had several cars. I said, as dumb as he is, he's doing something right. Right? Well, the good news is you don't have to be bright to be in the real estate business. You don't have to have an IQ of 175 to make it in this business, but you do need to understand the basics. And we started off out of school. I got lucky in college, and I answered an ad to manage a piece of property, and I managed a little 6-unit apartment building. Learned a little bit about management on somebody else's nickel, because it wasn't my building. And I didn't have an option. I didn't have a lease. I was just a manager. And that is not a bad way to start out in this business, because if you're young, you're getting started in this business. If you work for somebody else as a manager, you might learn from them. They might be able to tell you how to do some of this stuff. And when you make a mistake, who pays for it? They do. So it's a cheap way to learn. It's a cheap way to learn, and you get paid to do that. So that's not a bad way to start. And the long story short, I ended up selling that building, collecting a commission, and I had some money. And I said, this was easy money compared to working all year long for the same amount of money. So I got excited about real estate, got into sales, got my broker's license, had 13 salesmen at one time. Didn't like that at all, so I got rid of the 13 salesmen. Managed a bunch of property for other people. Didn't like that at all, so I kept raising my rates until everybody left me. That's one way to get rid of folks, isn't it? You know, we were charging 6% commission to manage property when I bought this company, and I immediately raised it to 10, and still some people hung around, so I raised it to 15, and they all quit. Well, that's kind of a graceful way to get out. But I learned from that experience that managing property for other people for just a commission, just a percentage of the rent, doesn't pay very well. And it's a bad position to be in, because when something breaks, the tenant calls you up, and they want it fixed when? Right now. And if you don't have the money to fix it, because you're an agent, you're a manager, now you've got to call the owner and say, something broke. Well, are they going to return your call real fast? They don't like that call either. So it's bad news on both sides. Now, if you're the owner, and I don't care if you own it in fee title or if you have a lease option to buy it, then you get to make the decision. So we're going to talk about being in control. And one great thing about a lease option is it puts you in control of a property without a lot of money up front many times. And we're going to talk. I got a whole list of things we'll talk about. So we'll cover that in a second. Well, we started buying property. The house I bought first, I bought in 1973, and it's the best investment I ever made for one simple reason. And what's that? I still have it. I still have it. So I've learned from that. And if you can buy quality property to start with, if you can buy property that doesn't drive you crazy, that attracts good tenants, then you will hold on to it for a long time. What property do you sell pretty fast? Property is a problem to you, right? Property doesn't make you money. A property that attracts the wrong kind of people that give you a hard time. Bad tenants, don't pay the rent, tear up the property. If you buy that kind of property, and then there are a lot of property like that out there, if you buy that kind of property, then you're going to be working all the time, and because it's so much trouble, you probably won't keep it 20 or 30 years, and it won't make you nearly as much money. So everybody knows who Warren Buffett is, and even though I give him credit for being a lot smarter than I am, we have similar strategies. We buy something that's good and we hold it for a long time. It's just that simple. And who else do you beat out of a whole bunch of money when you do that? The tax man. The tax man. If you buy something and don't sell it, you're not paying taxes on your gain, are you? It continues to stay invested. So it seems simple, but we got into the business of buying houses back in the 70s, and at that time I bought a bunch of other types of property. I bought motels and apartments and duplexes and some land deals. I was a little hyperactive back in the 70s, bought a lot of different properties because I figured out how to buy them without putting any of my money into the deal. I didn't have any money, so when I bought all these properties, I figured out some way to finance them, either through partners or investors or owner financing or lease options. So we bought a bunch of things, and then we learned by experience which ones we wanted to manage long term. I had met Valerie, who most of you met outside. I met her at a real estate closing in 1979. And I met her because I was buying a 4-unit building out of Golden Gate Point, which is a beautiful little piece of land right in the middle of Sarasota, right downtown Sarasota. And that little 4-unit building, which I owned for a long, long time, caused me more trouble, not because of Valerie, caused me more trouble than all the houses I had at that time. We had a full-time maintenance guy, I had a full-time bookkeeper, full-time secretary at that time, and the maintenance guy was to spend more time at that building than he did on all the other houses combined. Well, that's a sign, isn't it? Don't buy one of those. So even though it seemed like a neat thing to own, it was the right part of the world, nice little building, it just took a lot of time. People were breaking stuff all the time. It was an old building that was wearing out. So ideally you want to own properties that don't ever call you, right? You want to rent to people who never call you, because then you have a really good life, really good life. And if you own things that take a lot of your time, again, you probably won't hold on to them for a long period of time. So that's kind of the fast overview. We've just republished my book, Building Wealth One House at a Time. I think Valerie's got 2 or 3 copies with her. But if you're new at this and you want to learn more about the business of the houses, how to buy, manage, and sell, and finance, read that book. That's the cheapest way to get started. And that gives you a really good background on it. And what we're going to do today is going to take off on one little piece of that book and expand on it dramatically. I recorded 12 different courses, very much like this course, and they all go into detail on a specific part of the business, like management, like landlording, like buying on lease options. So if you want to learn the business one piece at a time, get on our website and look up what we've done recently. Okay, on the introduction here, a couple things. When I buy properties, typically, unless there's some reason not to do it, my first offer is always a lease option offer. And I do that for a couple reasons. And we'll talk about the advantages of a lease options in just a second. But one reason is, with a lease option offer, my down payment is generally, there isn't one, or it's very small. And I want to test people to see if they're able to sell with a little or no down payment. It's a test. It's a test. The other thing is typically the amount of rent I'm willing to pay for a house will be lower than a mortgage payment would be. So again, I want to test them a little bit to see if I can buy this property from them and they could afford to sell it to me with a low monthly payment. And if I get a yes, I many times will try to convert that particular offer into an owner financing offer. We'll talk about that as we go on. But it's a test. So my first offer, even today, and I bought a lot of property, is typically a lease option offer unless there's some overwhelming reason not to make that offer. Okay? Number two, and this is interesting, when I sell properties, my investment properties, I almost always sell them on lease options. And we'll talk about that in the second half of the course. So this course is divided really into two halves. The first half is on buying with lease option, and the second half is on selling with lease option. But I almost always sell on lease options for a whole bunch of reasons. And I won't jump ahead and talk about them now, but you'll see as we get there that there's a lot of good reasons to sell on lease options. A lease option is remarkable for a number of reasons. It's a simple offer, but it's a fast offer. If somebody was in this room today, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but if somebody was leaving their house this morning and on the way out the door your spouse said, "Get rid of this house today. I know you're going to a real estate meeting. Get rid of this house. Don't come back with this house." Is it hard to sell a house in one day? It is, isn't it? Through traditional means, it's hard to sell a house in one day. But if Mark has a house and his wife told him to get rid of it on the way over here today, could he and I make a deal using a lease option contract where I would buy that house from him and take over the responsibility for leasing it and maintenance and making the payments and give him some money today and pay him the rest when I had it? Could we make that deal today and write it down today? And he could go home and say to his wife, "I sold the house." See, so when people want to do things in a hurry, and do you find that in the world? That sometimes people make decisions, they're not well thought out financial decisions, typically, they're emotional decisions. They wake up one day and say, "I am done with this house," or "I'm done with whatever it is, let's get rid of it." If you can get in front of those people that are done and ready to sell something today, and you know how to move fast, you know how to write a contract that'll make them feel like that house is gone, then you can do a lot of business. And you can do a lot of business without a lot of personal risk. We're going to talk about that a little bit. If you think we're getting close to the top of the market, and markets come and go in this business, if you think we're getting close to the top of the market, what don't you want to do? Buy a house and pay how? All cash. If you pay it all cash and it goes down 30%, that's your money disappearing, right? What's even worse than paying all cash? Financing it. Borrowing 100% of the purchase price from a bank or an unfriendly lender who's going to make you pay them back even if the house drops in value, right? Because if you paid all cash and it goes down in value, it's sort of like buying a toy. I always tell my kids, buy your toys for all cash. They go down in value, of course, but it doesn't hurt quite so much because you already paid for them. But if you have a 100% loan on your car and it drops in value 30% next week after you bought it, now you owe more than the car's worth, right? How's that feel? Not so good, and it feels even worse in the real estate business. You know, if you own a house that used to be worth $300, now it's worth $200, and you still own $300, and you owe it to somebody you have to pay, that's a bad situation. So if you think we're getting closer to the top of the market, or if you think in your personal portfolio you just don't need to take any more risk, then this is an excellent thing for you to think about. How to tie up property without having downside risk, without having personal liability on the debt. You want to be able to take advantage of upside, but you want to avoid the downside risk. And that's what a lease option will help you do. Down to the bottom, we have continuing. We're kind of in the season of new consumer protection laws. We've got Dodd-Frank, which is a major consumer protection law that's been passed the last couple of years. And we'll probably see more like that. The state of Texas passed a law that dealt specifically with lease options because people were selling houses on lease options to folks, and then they would violate the agreement by just maybe one day, and they wouldn't close. Now, in contract law, if I have a contract to buy your house and we're supposed to close tomorrow, and we don't close tomorrow, and you come back next Tuesday and say, "I'd like to buy your house," can you make me sell it to you? This is an important question. No. The answer is no. You can't make me. The contract said it was supposed to close on, let's just call it September 1st. You show up on September 3rd and said, "I forgot about the closing, I've got the money, I want to buy your house." Now, if I'm smart and I'm a seller, what am I going to do?
Raise the price.
I'll probably sell them the house. Maybe we'll make a little bit more money, but I'll probably sell them the house because I don't want to get in a battle with them. But from a legal standpoint, they wouldn't be able to force me to sell that house. Well, lease option is a contract, isn't it? And that lease option contract will have dates in there, and the paperwork is important, and the dates are important. So if you do have an option or a lease option to buy somebody's house or to sell somebody's house, you have to pay attention to those dates. Now, when we're dealing with consumers, it's a little different than dealing with sophisticated investors or just commercial deals. And judges look at it a little bit differently. Judges will do equity. They'll make equitable decisions. And we'll talk about that as we get into this. And we're going to talk about Dodd-Frank as we get into this. But you need to pay attention to consumer laws as they change and how they may affect your business, because they will affect your business. Most of you know that I over 40-some years now, I've bought someplace in the range of the low hundreds, like 120, 130 properties. If you do the math, let's just call it 40 years and 120 properties. How many properties is that a year? It's 3. Okay, and that's not the real number, but it's pretty darn close to the real number. What kind of volume is that? Would you call that high volume or low volume? That's pretty low volume, isn't it? You hear people stand up sometimes and say, we bought 100 houses last year. And I always raise my hand and say, why? Isn't that a lot of work? Didn't you do anything else? Did you have any fun last year? Well, what else did you do, you know? And if you do buy 100 houses in a year, are you likely to make some mistakes? Sure. I mean, it's hard to do that kind of volume and not make some mistakes. Well, my business is really the opposite end of the spectrum from that. I buy very few properties, but I try not to make mistakes. The deals I make typically are very good deals. And part of this is I don't buy nearly as much as I did 20 or 30 years ago, but I'm still buying. We bought a couple houses last year. We'll probably buy a couple houses this year. We're always looking for houses. We got one right now I'm looking at. And when you find the right deal, you buy it. You find the right deal, you buy it. And as you've been in this business for a long time, one of your challenges is reinvesting your money. As the cash flow comes in, you don't want to just pile it up in the bank. You want to reinvest it in something. And real estate's what I know, so real estate's what I buy. Okay, buying with a lease option. Advantage of buying with a lease option. When I say lease option, let's make sure everybody understands the terms lease and option. What is a lease? Give me a simple definition of a lease. Who are the parties in a lease? Let's start there. Who are the parties? A landlord and a tenant, right? Keep it simple. Renter, the guy who owns the property. Don't come up with some name you don't understand, but it's a landlord and a tenant. So a lease is what? It's an agreement between a landlord and a tenant, yeah, to occupy a house. So you could explain that to somebody, couldn't you? There's two people. One person owns the house. One person wants to rent the house. There's an agreement between them. Does it have to be in writing? No, it doesn't have to be in writing. You can rent a house to somebody without writing anything down. Would that be smart? No, that wouldn't be smart. You want something in writing because you want to, especially in a residential landlord business, if you follow my example, you want to go through all the rules with a prospective tenant before they move into the house. You want to give them the bad news before they move into the house. And where residential landlords get in trouble sometimes is they let somebody move in a hurry without talking to them very much, and then they start telling them all the rules, and people get mad. So by telling people rules before they move into the house, what do? You eliminate the people who don't want to play by those rules. So if I say to you, you have to pay on the 1st, and you say, well, our check doesn't come in until the 7th. Can we pay on the 7th? And I say, no, you have to pay on the 1st. If you can't pay on the 1st, you should rent somebody else's house. And you should have rules, right? And you shouldn't be bending your rules for every tenant. You shouldn't customize your agreements for tenants. You should have an agreement that you think is fair and stick with it and explain it to somebody. So the lease, now sometimes you'll say here that a lease for more than a year has to be in writing. Is that true? If you want to enforce it, it has to be in writing. Okay? If you want to go to a judge, it has to be in writing. So you can have a month-to-month tenancy, which is what I use when I rent houses to people, typically. Or you can have a tenancy that runs for longer than a year. If it runs for longer than a year in most states, I think you need to have it in writing to be enforceable, which means but this is kind of a moot point, because I'm telling you, you should always have a written agreement with somebody. You should never let anybody move into a house without a written agreement. Now, if I'm going to lease your house, let's turn the table a little bit. Let's say you've got an empty house and you want to get rid of this house, and I want to lease it from you. How long a period of time would I like to lease it for? Is it going to be 6 months or a year? Long term, right? Because if I'm going to do this, this is going to be a business operation for me. I want to make as much money as I can, so I want to tie your property up for as long as I can. So we might be talking 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. We might be talking a very long period of time. So obviously, anytime we're talking long periods of time and we're talking leases, we're going to write it down. Everybody clear on that? Okay? Is a lease important? What's probably most important to you if you're going to sign a 10-year lease with somebody to lease their house? What's the one provision in there that's going to be really important to you? The amount of money is important, how much you're paying. And increases.
Making the payments.
What do you mean making the payments?
I mean, is the guy going to continue to make payments, guaranteed, or, you know?
Okay, you talk about payments that he owes somebody else?
The payments you're going to pay me.
Yes. Okay, if you're the seller and I'm the buyer, okay, I'm talking about what's the most important to me as the buyer, the person that's leasing the property now. Well, I'll just give you a clue. We're going to talk about it later. But you need a way, if you sign a 10-year lease, is that like signing a 10-year note? Is that like a promise to pay for 10 years? You need a way out. You need a way out. You need to say, if the world ends and I want out of this deal, I can get out of it. Okay? So there's things you can build into a lease, which you really can't build into a note. If I borrow $50,000 from you and give you a 10-year note, I can't just say, I want a way out. Okay? That isn't going to work. But in a lease, it's pretty common to have a way out. And a way out may be as simple as saying, after I've paid 6 months rent, I can terminate. Or if I pay you $5,000, I can terminate. You come up with some financial agreement that lets you out of that lease. And when you want to do that? Up front, before you take possession of the property, while the seller still has a problem. That's when you want to do it. So we'll talk more about that, but that's an important thing. Okay? So let's talk about an option. What is an option? You're going to write down options? If you have an option to buy something, you're going to write it down? Yes. Well, I think you want to write it down for a lot of reasons, right? One, your memory is going to change over 5 or 10 years, and two, it's not enforceable unless you write it down. There's a part of the law that talks about statute of frauds and common law that says if you don't write down agreements that pertain to real estate, you can't enforce them. You can't enforce them. So even though Mark and I might have a deal, I might give him $10 for an option to buy his house for 6 months, and he may live up to that, I can't make him live up to that unless we write it down. So we certainly want to write down an option. So what is an option? You're going to write it down. What do you call this piece of paper we write down on? It's a contract. It's a contract between two people, and there's consideration for the contract. If there's no consideration, if I don't give you some money or agree to do something for you, it's not enforceable. So there's elements of this contract we have to pay attention to. We're going to write it down, but we're not going to talk, when I'm talking to a seller, we're not going to use the words lease and option very often. Okay, it may show up the last day, but we're not going to go open the door with an idea that I'm going to lease your house with an option to buy it. We're going to open the door with the idea that I'm going to take over your house, take responsibility for your house, pay you some money, and when I save up enough money, I'm going to buy the house from you, which is all true, okay? Because it may take a while, but we're not going to use the terms lease and option unless we're dealing with somebody on the other side who really understands that, and most people don't. Most people, just like you, can't explain it. That was humor. A little humor. Okay. So let's talk about the advantages of buying with a lease option here on page 4. Number 1, a low or no down payment. You don't have to have a down payment, an option payment, if there's other consideration. And what might other consideration be? If I'm leasing Mark's house with an option to buy it, what may be the consideration? You plan to fix it up, okay? So I could put in the contract that I'll put a new roof on it, or I'll paint it, or do some work on the house, and that can be consideration. What else?
he's behind in the payments, you're gonna make those up?
Okay, guy's behind in the payments, so I'm going to write a check and make up some back payments to a bank. That's real money, isn't it? What else? Well, let me give you a thought. If I agree to lease the house from him for 10 years and pay him $1,000 a month for 10 years, is that giving him some money? Could that be the consideration for the option, the fact that I agree to lease the house from him for 10 years? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. So there needs to be some consideration, and sometimes you'll see in a contract or any other document, $10, another good and valuable consideration. But I'm telling you, if you're doing something specific, write it down so you don't forget, so you can document it. But if you're giving somebody some money, or you're painting their house or putting a roof on, or whatever you're doing, write that down. So if you ever did have a discussion about whether or not there was consideration, you would be able to show what the consideration was. But if you compare it to borrowing money from a bank to buy an investment property today, what kind of down payment would you have to make if you go down to Bank of America and finance an investment house? 20%. 20%, right? Plus what? Closing costs, which would be another 3 or 4%, couldn't it? So I mean, it's a big chunk of cash. So if you're buying a $200,000 house, you might be talking about $40,000 or $50,000 to get into that house. If I'm going to lease a $200,000 house with an option to buy, you think I can do it for less than $40,000 cash up front? See, and that's a major point. That's a major point. So sometimes when you find the right seller, you can get in one of these houses for a very small amount of money. And I'm going to take you through about a dozen case studies here during the course to show you different ways to do it. Lower monthly payments. When you borrow money, people calculate your monthly payments. They say, well, what's the interest rate going to be? How many years is it going to be? And they plug it into their calculator or look it up on an amortization schedule, and they say, well, here's what your payment's going to be then, right? That's not very negotiable. The only way you can negotiate a lower payment is longer term or lower interest rate, which are both good for you. But if you want a really low payment, that may be 1% interest in 50 years, and that's hard to sell sometimes. But rent's a different animal, isn't it? Rent is a different animal. Ask somebody what their house will rent for, they'll have some kind of opinion. Or if you're buying a house from somebody that's already rented this house, or maybe it's rented today, you know exactly what the rent is. And here's a question for you. You don't have to raise your hands, but is there anybody in this room that's renting a house to somebody right now and your rent's too low? Sure. Me, bunch of us, right? So do you think other folks are doing that too? A lot of people out there have houses way under rented and apartments way under rented and sometimes commercial buildings way under rented. And those are all opportunities for lease option offers because you have a number to work with. If somebody's charging $1,100 a month rent and you can pay them $1,000 a month and take care of all the work, that may be a terrific deal for both of you. So the monthly payment many times on a lease or rental basis is lower than your monthly payment would be if you borrowed the money, paid the interest back, amortized the loan over a period of time. Okay. So that's a big thing. But you have to pay some attention to what's going on in the cycle. Have rents gone up recently? So rents could be high in relation to values. I'm not saying they are, but they could be in your market. So pay attention to that and make sure you're not paying too much rent if your rental market's been really hot and prices haven't come up underneath for a while. Little or no closing costs. If Mark and I make a deal, sign a contract for I'm going to lease option his house, what closing costs do we have? Hardly any, right? Now, I may want to record something down at the courthouse just to make sure that we both remember this and make sure that he doesn't sell it to somebody else or somebody else doesn't make a claim against this house. But that's still going to be a nominal amount of money compared to borrowing $200,000 or $300,000 down at the bank. The costs of taxes and insurance often remain with the seller. If I lease somebody's house, who still owns it? They still own it, right? So they're still paying taxes and insurance. Now, sometimes when I buy a house from somebody using a lease option, I'll agree to make their payments. What could be included in those payments? Taxes and insurance. So you have to think through that. If you're going to agree to pay their taxes and insurance because you're going to agree to make their PITI loan payment, that's okay, but make sure the math works out and you're getting compensated for that because now you're taking more risk. Your cash flow and your profit if you sublet will be higher than if you own the property. if you're not paying the tax and insurance, and if you made some deal on maintenance, and we're going to talk specifically about how you negotiate who's going to pay for maintenance on a property, because that's a very important point if you have a long-term deal. If I have a 20-year option to buy a house, what's going to go bad in 20 years? Everything. Everything, right? So you can't make a deal with somebody to lease an option their house for 20 years and then not talk about maintenance. It just wouldn't make any sense. You'd have a lot more discussion. So it's best to get out front of that. And of course, most of the deals you're going to make are probably not going to be for 20 years. But if you did, you certainly want to talk about it. Lower liability for the property. If you don't own the property, does that save you from some issues? Headlines in this morning's news on the television were some mold issue, some poor guy, and they've got them all lit up about mold. Well, if there's mold in the house and you lease it with an option to buy, whose house is it? It's still theirs. And you may decide just to walk away from that house, or maybe there's a solution. Maybe you can fix it. But if it's got a sinkhole, if it's got some terminal issue, and you've got an option to buy it, isn't that better than owning it? A lot better than owning it. And from the tenant. Now, if you're going to lease a house, will the tenant look to you? If you're going to lease a house, if I lease Mark's house and sublet it to somebody else, the tenant I rent to, won't they look to me if there's some kind of problem? So you do have an issue with a tenant. And a couple things you might want to think about. If you see this as high risk in any way, who could lease the house from Mark and then sublet it to somebody else? That doesn't have to be me personally, does it? Doesn't have to be John Schaub, the person. It could be a corporation or an LLC or a trust. It could be another entity that maybe could protect that tenant, but may not have deep pockets. So if you were going to do a bunch of lease options, and some people do this, some people run this as a business, I won't mention names, but I know people that have 50 or 100 going at any one time. If you're doing that, certainly you want to think about liability. You want to make sure you have some insurance in case somebody does sue you. You have to defend yourself. And if you do, you're in pretty good shape. We'll talk about getting named in the owner's liability policy, but this is a very important point. If I do buy a house from somebody on a lease option, I want to make sure that I'm insured, and I want to make sure the house is insured, so I want to be named on their casualty policy and named on their liability policy. Okay, it's co-insured. Privacy keeps your name off the property records, which is pretty important to most of us, isn't it? If the government shows up and wants you to buy a license for every property you own, if you don't own them, you don't have to buy the license, right? The person who still owns that property has to buy the license. The government can be, I know the government's our friend, but they can also be problematic, right, when they want to know a lot about you. So if you can keep your name off the public records, there's not much negative about that. It's almost all positive. And financial privacy, which is a big deal. If I have bank loans, and where do those bank loans show up? They show up down at the courthouse. Where else do they show up? What other document do I file once a year that shows all my loans? My tax return. If I ever got in trouble, will somebody try to look at my tax returns? Okay, if I was running for president or something, and if they could see my tax returns, could they learn an awful lot about me? Yeah, they could see all this interest, all the loans. May not have the loan number, may not have even who I owe the money to, but now they can swear me in and start digging in and get a lot of answers. Big difference between that scenario and having an option to buy something, which does not show up on my tax return, okay, which is not on the public records. So if I was really interested in financial privacy, I would probably have options to buy property, lease options to buy property in different states. Wouldn't have to be all in my town. It could be out of town. It could be different places. So it's an excellent technique to keep your name off the public records. And of course, if you're just getting started, or if you're starting all over again, and maybe you have a credit issue, okay, having a way to buy something without going to the bank is a major advantage to you. And B down here says you have no personal liability for the debt. Well, that's a major deal. It allows you to buy property that you normally wouldn't buy. For example, how about this hotel? Who would like to own this hotel? Don't see a lot of hands going up. If you could lease this hotel for $1,000 a month with an option to buy it for $1 million, would you be interested? Sure. So at some point, see, even though you didn't think you wanted to buy this hotel, at the right price you would buy this hotel, right? And on the right terms you buy this hotel. But if I asked you to sign a personal note for $1 million, you might think about that for a second. You might go home and have a little conversation about that. But if you had an option to buy it, it'd be a no-brainer, wouldn't it? It'd be a no-brainer. Well, you're not going to buy this hotel probably, but you will find properties, and maybe they're houses, that you don't want to own, that you can buy cheap. You ever found one of those? Maybe it's in the wrong neighborhood. Maybe it's in bad shape. Maybe you don't ever want to have your name on the title for a lot of different reasons, but being able to control the property and make some money on the property is always a good thing. So this gives you a chance to do that without having personal liability on a loan. Number 9 allows you to leverage without qualifying for a loan. I think we just said that, but you don't have to prepare a financial statement to do a lease option deal. If you have past credit problems, it's not a problem. What you do have to do if you're going to buy a house with a lease option is you have to demonstrate to the person that you're buying from that you can perform. So if you're agreeing to make the payments, you should be able to demonstrate you can make the payments. If you're going to fix the house up, lease it to somebody else, you should be able to tell them some stories about you've done this before. You fixed houses up before. You've rented them to other people before. And you need to be able to demonstrate to them that you have the competence to make this deal work. Because with any long-term situation, lease options, owner financing, the seller has to have trust in you, has to believe you're going to follow through on whatever you say you're going to do. And you can make them feel better by doing what? How do you make somebody feel better about a deal? And you write it down, you say you're going to do it. How do you make them feel more comfortable? Do it, and right up front, what could you do? You could give them some money. You could give them some money. So if I write you a check for $10,000 and say I'm going to pay you more money, don't you feel better about that than if I don't write you a check at all to start with and say I'm going to pay you $10,000? Sure. So we're going to talk about structuring deals in different ways. And I'll tell you something I've learned over the years is many times I've been in a situation where I could get into a deal with a very small amount of money. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's bad. Because if I don't put up any money to start with, how much do I have to lose? Not much. Which means I may not be fully invested in this property. I may get sidetracked and go off and do something else and not make any money on this property, because if I don't make any money on this property, I don't have much to lose, right? If I write somebody a check for $10,000 to get into a property, will I pay attention to that property? Now I have $10,000 to lose, right? I will work that property and make sure that I make a profit on that property. And if I give somebody a check for $10,000 when I get into any kind of deal, won't that deal be a little bit better for me? Typically, the prices are going to be better, something's going to be better for me, or I wouldn't write a $10,000 check, right? So there should be more potential profit when I write a $10,000 check than sometimes when you get into something with a nominal amount of money. So that's just a lesson learned over the long run, is when I get involved in deals without much money, sometimes I don't pay as much attention to those deals as I should. But if I have a lot of money invested in a deal, and $10,000 is a lot of money to me, I do pay attention. I make sure that deal works. I almost always make profits on those deals. So it's just kind of psychologically get you into the deal. So even though it's fun to talk about deals where you don't have any money in them, if you didn't make any money, the story's not as good. So 10 says it allows you to take chances on making money on a property you wouldn't want to take title to. I said that a second ago. So when you find a property that's scary, we had a deal on a bowling alley one time that had bad water. Well, there's deals that are, there's a profit there, but you don't want your name on them. Sir, you can set up a corporation, you can set up an LLC, you can do some legal things to give you some asset protection. But if you can do it with a contract rather than go through all that, it saves you a lot of money. It gives you the ability to split the option from the lease. A lease with an option to buy. Are they connected, that lease and that option? How are they connected? What does it normally say? What would the option typically say if you had a lease and an option that ties them together? Doesn't it say if you don't make the lease payments, you can't exercise the option? The part of the deal is if I agree to lease Mark's house for $1,000 a month for 20 years, that I have to pay him the $1,000 a month, or I can't buy the house, because those two deals are tied together, aren't they? The lease is the consideration for the option, and if I don't make the payments on the lease, then my option is no good. But we'll talk about this afternoon when we talk about selling. If you sell a house to somebody on a lease option and they don't make the rental payments, can they buy the house from you? The answer from a practical standpoint is no, because if they can't make a rent payments, how are they going to buy your house? So the chances of them buying are no. And if they go to court and say, well, we've got an option to buy the house, I've always said, we've only had that happen once, but I say to the judge, I'm happy to sell them the house, but they need to make the rent payments too. And the judge sees the logic in that, and so you don't have a problem. So why else would you want to separate the lease from the option? Well, here's just a thought. You might have two different entities. You might have children. You might have other folks that you want to benefit. And they may want a certain kind of income. For example, let's say you had an older relative that wanted more income today, but just going to need that income for the next 5 or 10 years. What should they own? If we could separate the lease with the option. Somebody wants more income for the next 10 years. Should they own the lease or should they own the option? Lease. Because the lease may give them more income for the next 10 years. The option is probably going to, if it's a 10-year option, is going to make somebody some money, different kind of money, but not until 10 years, right? So you can separate these things. Now you can do things like that with partnerships and with trust and with some fairly complicated legal paperwork. But I'm going to show you how to do it with some very simple paperwork. And especially if you're dealing in-house with children, with relatives, with good friends, the lease option can separate these two things and give somebody a major advantage who needs that advantage today. Number 12 says the major risk of liability and destruction remains with the seller or property owner. If the house burns down, if the house gets swallowed up by a sinkhole or blown away from a hurricane, it's a tragedy for them more than it is a tragedy for you. Now, you may lose some money, but most of the risk of loss is still on their side. Comparing a lease option to a conventional purchase and financing. On page 7 here. Jones wants to sell his empty $200,000 house because he has payments of $1,200 a month and they're a burden. The market rent's about $15,000, but he doesn't want to deal with tenants. My argument has always been that most people don't buy real estate as investments for one reason. And what is that? They don't want to deal with the tenants. They don't like that interaction. They don't like that work. They don't want that risk. They don't know how to do it. If they learned how to do it, it would be easier for them. But isn't it true that it's probably easier to manage 10 properties than it is one? Because you have a system. You think about it more. You operate like a business. The people that have the most trouble are just trying to rent one house. So when you find somebody who just has one house rented, those folks typically want to sell. And you should make them offers. You should make them lease option offers. But make them some kind of offer, because most time they are not happy campers because they don't have systems. They don't have the training to manage tenants and select tenants and deal with tenants. And when a tenant calls them at 8 o'clock on Friday night, right, like last night, anybody ever get calls? Anybody ever notice that it seems like Friday afternoon is a time everybody figures out there's something wrong with their house and calls you? I'm going to start checking keeping records of this, but I can tell you, the whole week will go by and you don't get a single call, and then Friday afternoon the phone starts ringing, and we don't do phone calls anymore, but it just seems to be the way it is. But people don't like that. People don't like getting those calls. They don't know how to handle them. They don't respond well to them. They get emotional about them. Those are good people to buy from. So you offer to make his payments, and you say, how long would you like me to make your payments? Well, that's probably a pretty good question, right? What's the answer to that? It's not just like 2 months, isn't it? Probably a long time, especially if this is a burden to them and they feel like this house is eating them up and they want to get rid of this house. So you ask questions like that, which just talk directly about the benefits to these people. The benefit to them is they don't have to make any more house payments, and that is a big deal to most people. If this house is sitting empty and it costs them $1,200 a month, is that a lot of money to most people? That's more money than most people have. They probably couldn't come up with $1,200 a month, right? They don't have that much extra in their budget. So you look for that particular person. You agree to lease a house for $1,200 a month, which is their payment, and pay them $4,000 for an option to buy at a $200,000 price. Can you see those numbers working? Does that seem like a reasonable offer to you? And the big burden you're relieving them of, and there may be some management of this house too, but the big burden is those $1,200 a month payments. They don't have to worry about it. Do people worry about debt? A lot of people worry about debt. A lot of people worry about debt. There's a guy named Dave Ramsey who's in this town this weekend giving a speech about debt. Is he famous? He's famous, and he's famous because he helps people figure out how to get out of debt, and it's a really good idea. Down to the bottom then, we're going to compare this conventional financing with lease option on this particular house. If I bought this house with 20% down, it cost me $40,000. If I buy it on a lease option, it's $4,000. We all figured out which of those is better. The monthly payment on the conventional financing, 30-year, 6.5% loan, wouldn't that be about what the rate would be today if I go down to the bank and borrow money? Someplace in that range? Would be $1,011. It'd be about $1,200 in a lease option. Now here's the part I don't get to negotiate with the bank. With that bank loan, my principal payment each month would be $144. With a lease option, if I negotiate it, my credit each month is $400. Now, you have to get your head straight about buying or selling. When I'm selling on a lease option, I'm not going to give away a lot of credit for a couple reasons. Number one, nobody cares. Nobody will count it. But number two, it's real money if they do buy the house. But when I'm buying on a lease option, it's a great thing to ask for. And many times we've gotten people to give us as much as half of the amount of the payment as credit toward the purchase price. Well, if somebody will give you half, you have to do the math to make sure they're not going to owe you money when you buy this house. Okay? So you have to do that math pretty quick in your head. But we had a student, he was a good friend of mine, his name was Bob Bruss, who for years would write articles on purchasing on lease options because he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area where prices were very expensive, and he would buy houses on lease options, and he would always ask for half of the payments to be credited toward the purchase price. And he'd write articles about this is the right way to do it. So then he could show the article to the guy he's buying a house from, and that worked pretty good because it was in the paper, so he knew it was right. Taxes and insurance. They're always a responsibility of the owner. If they're included in that mortgage payment, you may take that responsibility, but they're always negotiable. Who's going to pay that? Same thing with maintenance. That's negotiable. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then the net cash flow is almost always positive with a lease option, where it's almost always negative when you buy a house at a retail price with a bank loan with 20% down. And that's why people can't quite figure out the real estate business. They say, well, we go out and buy a house, and it's worth $200, we pay $200 for it, we go down to the bank and borrow the money and make payments, we're not making any money. And is that a true statement? It is. If you pay a retail price and pay retail down to the bank, you probably won't make any money in this business. You have to be a little smarter than that. So the people that make more money either learn how to buy cheaper or they learn how to finance properties so they have more cash flow to start with. Then, any questions or comments on that page? Just want to put things in perspective for you.
Well,
yes, sir.
Taxes and insurance, if you bought it on lease option, now the house burns down, and you have a loss yourself, don't you?
Well, you might. You know, if you give somebody, if I write you a check for $5,000 and your house burns down next week, and I don't participate in the insurance, I probably would lose the $5,000.
Are you getting?
That'd be my downside risk,
additional
though.
Insured on it?
If you got named as additional insured, if you did your paperwork right, and you got named as additional insured, and your contract says that we get the benefit of the insurance proceeds over the option price, you might even make a little bit of money. You know, if it's insured for more than your option price. So it could go either way. But the big picture is you won't have a lot of cash invested, so it puts you in a very strong negotiating position. You know, if you only have $5,000 in the deal, you're pretty strong. If you have $50,000 in the deal, now you're in a weak negotiating position. You need to get that $50,000 back. You can't just walk away from it. So it just puts you in a stronger position. The more leverage you have, the stronger the position you're in. And this is a way to get some pretty dramatic leverage. Next page is disadvantages of buying on lease options. One thing people are always concerned about with any kind of contract that's an option where you haven't closed yet, and this could happen with just a long-term closing too, is what would happen if something happened to the seller? If the seller couldn't deliver a good title, if the seller dies, if somebody sues the seller, if they file bankruptcy, if they get divorced. Now, all those things are unlikely to happen if we have a 30-day closing. But if we have a 5 or 10-year closing, there's a good chance one of those things might happen, right? So you need to anticipate that and say, okay, if something happens where these people can't deliver a good title, somebody else is trying to take it away from them, what can we do? And so I've got a whole section on that in the book where we're talking about different ways to protect yourself. But you can protect yourself. And the simplest way to protect yourself is to give them some money up front and record a mortgage for that amount of money because it puts you in the chain of title. And we'll talk more about that later. Number two is your investment may be illiquid and hard to borrow against. If I had a house that I own today that was worth about $200,000, it had a $150,000 loan on it, $200,000 house, $150,000 loan. So I have $50,000 in equity. Could I sell part interest in that house and get some of my money back? Let's have a little auction. Anybody buy half interest in that house for $5,000? People are doing the math now. There's $50,000 on the table. Half of that would be $25,000. If you could buy $25,000 for $5,000, wouldn't you buy it? Okay. What if I agreed to manage the house so you never had to see that house again? Anybody pay me $10,000 for half interest in that house now? Yeah, a lot of people would. Maybe 15 or 20. So I have something that I could sell because I'm on title. Everybody clear on that? It's in my name. I'm on title. That's a lot easier to get money from. Either borrow, I could borrow some money against it, or I could sell part interest. What if I have an option to buy that same $200,000 house for $150,000? Now how many people will give me $15,000 for half interest in my option? Well, two guys in the back of the room. Smart guys always sit in the back. I won't point them out. But because it is worth something, isn't it? Now, would you want to read the paperwork before you wrote the check for $15,000? You better, because when you say option, that's a contract, right? And that contract, if it's not drawn to protect the buyer, if there's not a lot of protection in there for the buyer or the optionee, you may not be able to enforce it. Plus, you're going to look at the house and see what the upside is. But if it's the right deal, it's still bankable, but it's bankable with a lot smaller percentage of the audience, right? Very few people will get in that deal with me. So a couple lessons then, right? If you have an option to buy something, you want to make sure your paperwork is the best that it can be. You know, like the Marines, the best it can be. You want to have paperwork that you could sell to somebody else, and that's always a good way to look at it. You should say, if I have this option to buy and I need some money, could I sell it to somebody else and get some of my money back? Or could I sell part interest to somebody else and get my money back? And the answer is no, you need to work on that paperwork some more. It should give you protection. It should be a safe enough deal. A lot of folks have an option that's not very enforceable. The paperwork is sloppy. They don't do a title search before they buy it. They just don't know much about the property. And that is not an option. That's a hope, right? An option is a contract that's enforceable. So make sure you've got that. You may have liability on a lease. We talked about this a second ago, but if you sign a 10-year lease, you may be responsible for making those payments unless you give yourself a way out. So we talk specifically here to have a liquidated damages clause in that lease. It says something like, after we've made a certain number of payments, we can walk away from it, or we have the right to pay you a certain amount of money and walk away from it. Have some specific considerations spelled out in that get you out of that deal if you don't want to own it. Number 4, you don't own the property, so you don't have the tax advantages. You can't depreciate it, but what can you do? If I lease a house and sublet it to somebody else and the air conditioner breaks and I fix the air conditioner, is that a deductible expense to me? Sure. So any expense I have, this is a business operation, any expense I have that's related to that house is deductible. So it's not like I can't deduct the expenses. In order to qualify for a 1031 exchange, I probably have to go into title. Now, options are renegotiable. So if I've got an option to buy a house from Gary back there, and we decide 5 years later we want to go 5 more years, isn't that a fairly simple transaction to extend that option for 5 more years? Sure, just a new contract. Maybe there's some consideration, maybe there's not, but it's a new contract. We can renegotiate. If we decide I don't want to buy that house from Gary, but I'd like to buy another house that he owns, would that be a possible deal to make? Where I say I won't exercise the option on this house, but I want an option to buy something else you have. The answer again is yes. So these options are fairly flexible things, and in many cases, you never end up actually going into title. If I have a 10-year option to buy something, perhaps the person who still owns the property, if I'm buying a house from Mark on a 10-year option, he may call me up in 6 years and say, John, I need my money today, in which case we have to do something different. We're not going to wait the 10 years. So a lot of things happen over a longer period of time that give you an opportunity to make a profit today. Okay. Sources of lease option purchase opportunities on page 9. First one I listed, a vacant rental house. A vacant rental house. Where are you going to find a vacant rental house? And I'm not talking about what state or what town. How are you going to find one when you go home? How would you find it?
Drive around the street, look for it.
Okay, you can drive around and look for them. One thing we've learned, I teach a 2-day class, and I actually make the students go out in that class and walk on streets and neighborhoods. Because when you drive up and down the street, I don't care if you're just going 5 or 10 miles an hour, you're still not going to see everything that you'll see if you walk up and down that street. So if you've never done this, when you get home, pick some streets you like, walk them. You'll see houses you've never seen before, and you'll notice things about houses you've never noticed before. Okay, like the back door is open and there's no back door, stuff like that. You just don't see that when you're driving down the street. So vacant rental houses, why are they a pretty good target to make a lease option offer? There's no money coming in. And who owns a vacant rental house?
Somebody.
A landlord. And if it's the only one they own, or if they don't like it anymore, they may want to get rid of it. So you should always be looking for these. Now, we said earlier, you may not want to buy some properties, and you may not want to buy a vacant rental house in a rough street, but you could lease option it and then sublet it to somebody else. We'll talk about that a little bit later, and make a profit, and it might be a wise thing to do. So if you find the right one, it's an opportunity. Where else would you find a vacant rental house? Where could I get on my computer and find vacant rental houses? All the websites that have rental houses listed, right? We won't give them any credit here on our course, but it's going to change over time. Hadn't it changed pretty dramatically over the last 10 years? It's going to change a lot more in the next 10 years. So you just have to stay on top of it. But there's always going to be a source of vacant rental houses. And if all you did was mine that source, you'd make a deal every once in a while. Now, I don't mean you're going to make a deal every week. But if you did this on a regular basis, you would probably make a deal a month. If you followed up on every house for rent in your town, you're going to find some landlords that are not happy. And if you'll follow up with them, you can make a deal on a pretty regular basis. A full house with management problems. Where are you going to find a full house with management problems? How would you spot that? What is a management problem on a full house? An eviction, right? People that are evicting. So is that public records? Can you find out who's evicting and who they're evicting? Sure. With a little bit of research, you can find that out. How can you notice from the street sometimes that somebody's being evicted? The pile of stuff in their front yard, right? People hardly ever pile stuff in their front yard. Generally somebody else doing that for them. So when you drive by a house and you see all their couches and everything else piled up in the front yard, you should stop and talk to whoever's there and look up and see who owns it and call them and talk to them. There's a good chance they don't like that house anymore, and you can make a deal on it. Houses where seller has less than a commission in equity. Are there any of those? Are there any houses that are underwater in your town? There was an article in the local paper here a week or two ago, very recently, that talked about 30-some% of the houses in this area are still underwater. They still owe more than what they're worth. And I don't know where they got that number or how old that statistic is, but I would assume that in most markets there's typically always somebody who owes more than their property's worth, especially when the credit gets loose. Because what do people do when credit gets loose? They borrow a whole bunch more money, right? So it's pretty easy to get underwater if people just continue to lend you money. Well, when you find somebody who's underwater, how much are they trying to sell their house for? If you've got a house you owe $250 on, and the house only worth $225, and you list it with a realtor, what's the price going to be? $250, maybe plus a commission. Anybody seen an overpriced house recently? I've got one I've been watching for a year. It's $100,000 overpriced. Okay, and gone through 2 realtors so far. I'm just waiting for the people to finally decide to sell the house, because when they finally decide to sell it, how much are they going to get for it? Someplace around market. I don't care how good your market is. People typically don't pay $100,000 too much for a house. It just doesn't make any sense. So you look for properties that are overpriced Okay? And if you're listed with realtors, you might make your offer through the realtor, or you might just wait till the sign comes down and go visit with the folks. But when you find a house that's way overpriced, it's probably not going to sell. That's the number one reason houses don't sell. And go make your offer. Can you pay too much for a house with a lease option if you can get a long enough term?
Yes, sir.
And why can you do that? Let's make sure everybody understands that. Why can you do that?
The market will catch up.
Well, the market might catch up. We don't know what the market's going to do, right? Market could go down over the next 10 years. But what's the real reason you can do that? You don't have much to lose. You don't have much to lose, because you're not going to give that person a whole bunch of money, are you? If somebody's $10,000 or $20,000 above the market, you're not going to write them a check for $10,000 or $20,000. But what you might do is take over their payments, because what might they have? Let's say they owe $250 on the house that's worth $225. Tell me about that $250 loan if they got it the last 4 or 5 years. Could be a 30-year 4% loan, right? Okay, and I'll show you an example about that in a second. So there may be some opportunity in there if you look at it a little bit differently than most people do. Okay, it's not a house that you're going to pay cash for at a retail price. That doesn't make any sense. You're not going to write them a big check, but if you can make the right deal, if you could take over their payments, which are low enough, and you could rent it for a profit for 10 years, would you take over the responsibility for a house if you could make $200 or $300 a month on it for 10 years? A lot of people would, because that's a fairly low risk deal. Okay? And if you're getting started, that's an excellent way to get started. Houses with 2 or more loans totaling more than the owner can afford and more than market rent. Okay? Where are you going to find those? Anybody ever buy a house and rent it back to the seller? I'm the only guy in the room that's done that. Why would somebody want to rent their own house back?
Kids in school.
What's the real short answer? They like the house, right? Why would they sell a house that they like? It's a money issue. It's a money issue. If you can solve the money issue, and that's what they're telling them. See, people don't hear that sometimes. But if somebody, and that's why I always ask the question, would you like to rent the house back from me if I bought it? If they say yes, what does that tell me? They like the house, and they've got some kind of money problem. Well, that's the kind of problem I like to solve. Some people like to rehab houses. They just think that's fun. Okay? If you go out and rehab a house, is that a lot of work? That take a lot of time? Take a lot of money? What about rehabbing the financing? Is that a lot of work? No, I like to rehab financing. If I can fix the numbers, if I can solve a money issue with somebody, I can make a lot of money without leaving my office, and that's my kind of work, air conditioned. Okay? I don't get dirty. I don't hit my thumb with a hammer, and nothing bad happens to me that day. And sometimes I can make a deal just by using the telephone and the computer and talking to people. Okay, we'll talk about some deals like that in a second. House that needs repairs before it can be sold at a retail price. Okay? Are there a bunch of houses like that out there? Yes. Always. We got a bunch of old houses, right? So if you're in an area that has houses that are more than 20 years old, 30 years old, they're going to need roofs, air conditioners, windows, all sorts of stuff. And if they're rough enough, what do lenders like to see today? What kind of shape do they want that house in? Good shape. If the house has got a half-shot roof, sometimes they want to get you to put a new roof on. It's kind of a roofer bonanza, isn't it? But they do silly things. They make you replace stuff that really is still functional, that'll last 5 or 10 more years sometimes, but they make you replace it. I could never refinance my house. I've got the original screens in my house. They're 30-some years old. They make me replace all my screens. I've got an air conditioner that's 25 years old. They wouldn't like that. So, there's some things that do last a long time if you take care of them, but they're just looking at a spreadsheet, aren't they? And they say if the roof is this old or the air conditioner is this old, got to put a new one in. Well, that's expensive. And a lot of people that have that house that needs work don't have the cash to make those repairs. And now they've got catch-22 because you can't sell that house to anybody that needs a bank loan. When you find that house, and you'll find them if you go out and look, these houses are listed in many cases, then you can make a deal. Another source of that house is if you have people doing work for you. If you have a roofer or an AC guy or a plumber does work for you on a regular basis, tell them what you're looking for. Just don't tell them you buy houses, because that's way too broad. Tell them exactly what you're looking for. The roofer, and roofers you got to talk to kind of slowly, but tell them you need a house that needs a roof. See, they got that. And if the people can't afford to buy the roof, tell them to call you, because you'll pay for the roof. Now, is that good for the roofer if you pay for the roof? Yeah, it's good for everybody. So you got to make it good for them, or they're not going to call you. Number 6, a house has been listed several times but is not sold. You ever see that? Where can you find those? Can you get online and figure that out? Yeah, but what I do, I buy in certain neighborhoods. I have a half a dozen favorite neighborhoods in my town, so I'm driving through those neighborhoods all the time. I own property there already, so I know what the rents are, I know what the prices are. And when a house comes up in one of those neighborhoods that's been listed several times, I notice that. I pay attention. Different sign, right? Different color sign, although everybody's got the same color, it seems like anymore. But you notice different signs in the front yard. So you look for about the third sign, and you wait for that one to come down, and you go make an offer. More expensive houses which are slow to sell. Isn't that true in most places that as you go up, if you notch up in price, the paper here locally is saying the houses under 300, under 250 sell just like hotcakes. So if you go up to 400, they're not selling like hotcakes, right? I don't know what they're selling like, but maybe not so fast. So you look for a price range that's a little slower, and you'll find that when we start talking about numbers here with lease options, and think about this for a second, as the prices go up, what happens to the rents? Do they go up just like the prices do? No. A $100,000 house, and just using this as an example, might rent for $1,000 a month, might rent for more than that, right? $200,000 house may rent for $1,500 a month, or a little bit more, give or take a little bit. $300,000 house might rent for $1,800 or $1,900 a month. $400,000 house, now we're getting pretty close to the top of the rental market, aren't we? It's not going to rent for $3,000 a month because nobody's going to pay $3,000 a month. Because if you had $3,000 a month, what would you do? You'd buy. So there's some tipping point in most markets where the rents just level off no matter how expensive the house is. Now there are exceptions. You got a beachfront house, you got a house you're renting by the week, numbers are all strange and that kind of stuff. But in a normal house, kind of normal neighborhood, look for that tipping point. And if you can just get 1 or 2 notches above that, you lose a lot of your competition because people just don't think about buying those houses. But because the rents are lower, the rents will almost always be lower than the cost of borrowing money and buying that house. So you can make a good deal there. Investors with portfolios of rental houses are selling, so retiring investors, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but I'll bet you if I got an honest show of hands, there are people in this room that would like to get rid of their rental properties. Well, one great way to get rid of your rental properties, and I had a student move down here from D.C., his name was Frank, and he sold his rental properties to members of our local investment club on lease options. You sell it to them for a small amount down, $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 down. He would lease them to them for 5 years with an option to buy for that period of time. And most of them made some money doing that. And he felt good about it because he was helping people who didn't have much cash get into the housing business, learn the housing business, and he would kind of tutor them. He'd give them some advice with the house. And by doing that, he was able to liquidate his portfolio. And we'll talk about selling this afternoon, but one of the reasons he did that was that he got top dollar for those houses with no closing costs and no empty houses and no fix-up costs. So there's some major advantages to selling a house on lease option. And down at the bottom then, lenders, private and institutional stuck with REOs. Can a bank rent a house? Can a bank that forecloses on a house rent that house? The answer is yes. Do they like to? No. The answer is no. But they can, and they did during this last downturn. They had houses here in town rented for nominal amounts of money. There was a house worth about $400,000 or $500,000 they were renting for $1,000 a month. I mean, they do some silly things just to get them occupied, just to keep the mold out of them, just to get the air conditioner running, right? If you had a $500,000 house, wouldn't you rather have it occupied? Yeah, you'd rather have that air conditioner running and people mowing the grass. So some interesting things happen during downturns. So if you're in the business and there's a big downturn and lenders, and remember there's lenders that are different than banks. There are a lot of banks in the lending business, but who else makes a lot of loans? Individuals. Well, Green Tree, I mean, there's other institutions, but individuals make a lot of loans in your towns. People that have pension plans make a lot of loans in your town. And if somebody has a pension plan and they loan somebody some money and that deal went bad, do they want to manage that house typically? No, they're making lots of money doing something else. This is supposed to be a passive investment, this loan they made. Those people are excellent folks to make lease option offers to because you solve a major problem for them. You get rid of that house, you save them. So and maybe if somebody made a pension plan loan for $300,000 and now they're stuck with a house that's in bad shape, and if they just wholesale it, they get $200,000. Would they be happy about that? If you have $300,000 out in your pension plan and now all you can get is $200,000, would you be happy? No. What do they want to do? What's their primary goal? To get that $300,000 back. Because you can't deduct that. That's a terrible loss to take, is that $100,000. So if you could go to them and say, we could pay you $300,000 for that house, well, you have their attention. Sure, they'll be delighted. They don't know how you're going to pay them, but you've got the conversation going. And if your $300,000 is an option price and is good for 10 or 15 years, is there a chance you can make some money on that deal? Yeah, yeah. And if you do make and here's a little side note, if you ever make a deal with somebody who'd made a $300,000 loan, what else do they have? They have more money. They wouldn't loan every nickel they have to one person on one loan. They have more money. So these are excellent people to do business with because maybe they have a dozen loans like that. There was a guy here in town that had about 100 loans like that. Well, those are folks you want to do business with because they have a lot of money, but they don't want to be hands-on. They don't want to be fixing these houses up and selling them. They want somebody to solve that problem for them, and you can do that.